Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the magnificent York University. It's great to see so many of you here with us this evening. My name's Stewart Regan. As some of you may know, I was the CEO at Yorkshire County Cricket Club from 2006 to 2010. And then after that, I was CEO of the Scottish Football Association. And I'll be chairing this session tonight, chatting with Simon about his book, and more of that in a moment. And also at the end of the discussion, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you'd like to ask as well. So it's great to see so many of you here. It's my great pleasure to introduce our special guest for this evening, joined by Simon Wilde. Simon has been the cricket correspondent for the Sunday Times since 1998. He's covered some 340 test matches and major cricket events during that period. He's also the author of 13 books. He's authored England, the Biography, which is obviously a history of the England men's team. And he has written The Tour, which won the MCC Cricket Society Book of the Year. And the book we're going to be talking about tonight is Chasing Jessop, the mystery of England cricket's oldest record, which was actually, I believe, the Wisden Cricket Book of the Year in 2025, Simon. So it's a great opportunity for us to find out about this very, very special record and a little bit of intrigue behind it. And I'm sure we'll try and discover a few Yorkshire connections during the evening as we talk about the book. And there's some famous Yorkshire characters who feature, as I'm sure some of you will know. So, without any further ado, let's kind of get into the discussion, Simon. We're going to go back in time, around 124 years, to August 1902. We're going to talk about a test match between England and Australia, which the Daily Mail at the time called the greatest cricketing drama of modern times. A proper fight back, a proper comeback. And we're going to focus on one player, Gilbert Jessop primarily, although I'm sure we'll touch on other characters during the evening. And he holds England cricket's oldest record. So maybe, Simon, you could give us a little bit of background into what is the record that we're talking about, first of all, and why did it come to intrigue you so much?
Yeah. Well, the record, as some of you will probably know, is the fastest century ever scored for England in a test match by balls measured, and it was understood to be 76 balls. And it's amazing that it's lasted for 124 years, obviously. I became intrigued by it because I've been reporting on England's Bazball team for the last few years, and they repeatedly got close to that record, but never quite managed to break it. And the more this went on, the more intrigued I became about the Jessop record. And what was was it accurate to say that it was actually off 76 balls? What were the circumstances? I mean, it was a long time ago. I knew enough about the history to know that maybe scoring wasn't quite as thorough then as it is now, obviously in meticulous terms of how things are measured these days. So I started looking, and quite quickly I realised that actually the facts were pretty sketchy. And without sort of getting to the end at the start, I discovered that the 76 ball record was perhaps not correct. And once I sort of discovered that, I was hooked then. And I never intended to write a book about Jessop's innings. It was only when I discovered this that I thought I'm going to have to go in so deep. It'll take a book to explain the story. And so I was hooked, and I started that about 2 years ago. And part of the problem was that I thought the record would be broken at any point. And
so you were watching what was happening out there?
I mean, I was watching Harry Brook and Jamie Smith go mad, and thinking the record's going to go, and then they just miss it, and then I'd think that's phew, I can carry on researching Jessop, and so on. So it was a slightly madcap roller coaster ride.
What's ironic, and I'm sure many of you in the room will know this tonight, that we're having this meeting, this discussion here in York, and just round the corner there's a school, St. Peter's School, which was attended by Johnny Bairstow, who in 2022 actually became the closest current England player to get near Jessop's
Johnny
record.
got 100 off 77 balls in what was sort of regarded as the first Bazball test at Trent Bridge against New Zealand, when England chased down 299, 300 in 50 overs. I mean, it was a mad afternoon, and he got his 100 off 77 balls, and we knew in the press box what the Jessop record was, and amazingly he played out 2 dot balls before he hit the runs that got to his 100, and we all knew if he gets the runs now, he's going to break the record, what we thought was the record. But he just sort of nudged them into the offside, no run, and then he got 3 to get to the 100. So he is Johnny Bairstow is the closest.
At 77 balls, he's the closest, and at the time, you and maybe some of your colleagues thought it was 76.
Yeah.
And as we'll discover later this evening, there's a little bit of kind of perhaps disagreement about exactly how many balls it was, but it was certainly more. It was less than 76.
Yeah, pretty sure it's fewer.
We'll come to that later on. Let's talk a little bit about Gilbert Jessop. So reading your book, it was fascinating because here was this amateur player. He wasn't a highly educated player, very unconventional. They called him the Croucher. He had a very unusual style. Tell us a little bit about Gilbert Jessop, the man, Gilbert Jessop, the cricketer.
Well, what was unusual about Jessop was that although he was an amateur player, he didn't have a conventional education. In cricketing terms, I mean, he went to Cheltenham Grammar School. His father was a governor there, but his father died when Gilbert was 15. Gilbert had to leave the school, go and work as an assistant teacher at other schools to continue his education. He left Cheltenham. He eventually went to Cambridge, but he went to Cambridge quite, much later than you'd normally do, sort of 21 rather than 18, say. And he missed out on the sort of formal cricketing coaching that you'd had if you'd gone to, say, Eton and Harrow, as a lot of the amateurs did, and then went to Oxford or Cambridge. So he himself said that he was never properly educated, tutored, if you like, at batting. He just played the way he saw fit, so he was quite rustic in a way, but he just tried to smash the ball as far as he could. And when he bowled as fast as he could. And when he fielded, he sort of threw himself around in a sort of uninhibited fashion, like a sort of boy would rather than a sort of grown up. And it worked, obviously, for him in his own particular way. But he was maybe frowned upon by some people who felt that he wasn't a proper cricketer, and he'd be looked down upon by other amateurs. And England didn't always trust his methods to pick him. He only played 18 tests in a test career that spanned 10 years, so he was left out more than he was selected, really.
Yeah, and he had this reputation for being a bit of what I would call a gung-ho cricketer. He went out and tried to hit everything and tried to score as quickly as he can.
So his early years, first 3 years as a first-class cricketer, not professional cricketer, first-class cricketer, he was stumped all the time. He was stumped in 1 in 6 innings he ever played. He just charged down the wicket. And he developed this style, this crouching style, which he used because he was quite good at several sports, and he was a sprinter. He was a very good sprinter. And when he was sprinting, I mean, this is the days before they went into sort of blocks, if you like, but he would crouch at the start of his sprint to set off. That was the way he could get fast. And he thought, well, I'll apply that sort of crouching method at the crease. If I'm going to charge down the pitch to attack the bowler, I'm going to crouch. So he did crouch, and it was a very unusual. I mean, the person I'd compare it to a little bit is maybe Owen Morgan. If you remember when he played for England, he crouched quite a lot. He was a left-hander, obviously, but he would get quite low. And I can't think of another player particularly, but I think Morgan's probably the one. He sort of bobbed down, and I think Jessop did the same thing, get his eyes below.
But he became a cult hero in many ways amongst many of the cricketing public at the time, because he was exciting to watch. He would score quickly. And he actually scored. He made some very big scores in county cricket back in the day.
So he got what was the fastest 100 in all first-class cricket in terms of time. They often measured it in minutes rather than balls, which was 40 minutes, and it was against Yorkshire at Harrogate, which is where you live, isn't it? Yeah. So against a very good Yorkshire attack, 1897. That was when he was just starting to sort of emerge as a proper player. He got 140 minutes, which is obviously phenomenal. And I think it was calculated to be about 46 balls. It's been sort of retrospectively looked at. So he did some amazing things, and the crowds loved him. I think once W.G. Grace sort of like was over the hill, Jessop became the new superstar attraction, along with people like Ranjin Fry. But Jessop was more entertaining than them. He'd cause mayhem, really. So,
but he wasn't everybody's cup of tea, because he was overlooked by the England selectors on a number of occasions. And before the test in 1902 that we're going to talk about shortly, he was overlooked by F.S. Jackson and Lord Hawke to play for England, and England's performance wasn't particularly inspiring, was it?
No. So yeah, the England selection panel was not fixed. They'd co-opt a few people. Once they decided that a couple of amateurs were going to play, they would co-opt them onto the selection panel. So in 1902, the series that we're talking about here, the captain A.C. McLaren, who was a Jessop fan, he was one of the selectors. And then they said, well, F.S. Jackson's going to play every match. We're sure, he's a good chap. We'll have him on the selection panel as well. Jackson was more equivocal about Jessop's abilities, and he actually left him out. And so, in fact, if you go forward to 1905, the next Ashes series in England, F.S. Jackson was captain by then, and Jessop got a duck in the first test, and then he was dropped after that. And Jackson was the prime mover behind that. Okay. They're sort of... It wasn't a feud exactly, but their differences were well documented, and Jessop's son talked about it.
So we've got this guy that's unconventional, amateur, started life as a bowler, but then became a very gung-ho, quick-scoring batsman. He's brought back into the England squad for this test. And the fifth test, which we'll get onto later, is going to be in London. Let's just look at what was happening obviously in London, but in England generally, because it was at the turn of the century. There was a lot going on with technology, with the development of cities and towns and newspapers and photographs becoming more and more prevalent in newspapers. Tell us a little bit about Britain in the early 1900s.
Yeah. Well, there was a sort of technological revolution going on. There was a lot of interest. I sort of went through, obviously, the papers for that sort of summer, just looking for Jessop stuff, really. But there was a lot of articles about things like the fastest trains that ever been, like a mile-a-minute train, which was 60 miles an hour. That was considered cutting edge at the time. Possibly still is, I don't know.
It is by modern standards now.
So the thing about trains, there was cars that were going at 100 miles an hour. I think there was a Frenchman who did it in summer of 1902, and there was an American guy.
Which is incredible in 1900.
100 mile an hour car. And what else? There was, the Olympics had been revived in 1896, and that obviously brought in the whole thing about sort of going faster and further and the rest of it. So,
like a need for speed. Almost.
Yeah, and things were measurable, usually in time rather than, say, in balls faced in terms of cricket. But everyone was looking for a way of pushing the boundaries, I suppose, in all sort of activities. There was a sense of trying to push the barriers forward. Also, in terms of things like, there was electricity was coming on. There was the telephones were becoming more common, although basically they were for people who are sort of better off, if you like. Not your sort of average person wouldn't have a telephone, but there was a lot of stuff happening in society. Like the gramophone was coming in, cinema halls, silent cinemas, silent movies were starting to become a thing. There was a lot happening around that period, I think, and the Eiffel Tower also was built at that point as well.
What do you think? What impact did you think that had on the game of cricket and the development of cricket at the time, Simon?
Well, I think WG's rise is often put down to the railway network made the country smaller, so you could then have a county championship where people could move around and play each other all over the country. That was one thing. But by the time we get to Jessop's era, the telegraph system was highly sophisticated. It's been called the Victorian Internet, and it was like that. It helped transmit news around the country within seconds, minutes, and the rest of it. So at a test match like Jessop's one, you could have regional papers all over the country taking reports, and they would be appearing within, I think the 45 minutes of the finish of the game, there would be reports in the Yorkshire papers, things like that. So this made a big difference to popularising celebrities, full stop. And in the case of cricket, obviously, people like Jessop.
Yeah.
So that was a big thing. And then obviously on the back of that, you had the Daily Mail starting in 1896, I think, the Daily Express in 1900, popular papers who actually wrote stories about people rather than just parliamentary reports, which is what my paper, The Times, did, crushingly dull and vast length. These other popular papers would write about people and human interest stories, I suppose. And they often wrote the best reports of this test match, those sort of papers, because they sort of got what the really interesting thing about the game was, so they dramatised it better. The report in the Times and the Telegraph are among the most dull reports of this match. But
and we'll talk about the reports of this match later on. But what you've described is a country with an incredible love of cricket, county cricket especially, but Test cricket, which was about 25 years old at the time. It was still really developing. International matches were kind of getting going. And cricketers saw technology as a way of getting in the newspapers, and photographs or the very early sketches were making them more celebrity. So that was what was going on in the country. But the game of cricket, the rules and regulations were still kind of evolving, really. And there were differences in rules and regulations in Australia to England, and then even like local regulations that sat over the top. Tell us a little bit about those differences, Simon.
Yeah, so, well, the most interesting one in terms of the Jessop story is the boundary sizes. Obviously, different grounds around the country had different boundaries. There weren't many, what I'm trying to say, there weren't many stands. You'd have a pavilion, which would be a big Victorian brick building, very impressive, but the rest of the ground would be maybe just wooden terraces. Maybe occasionally there might be one covered stand or a sort of a refreshment tent, that sort of stuff, but it was very primitive. And basically they would allow, they didn't really have boundary markers very much. They just, if you hit 4, it would run up to where the spectators were, and if they were standing a bit nearer in, then they'd be there, and if they were further back, it's further. And actually, until 1911, so after this game, a 6 hit in England had to be hit out of the ground. So you had to go over the seating and out into the street, effectively. Well, at the Oval, where this match was played, that was the biggest ground in the country. It was a huge area because it was used previously for FA Cup finals and England football and rugby internationals in the 1870s, 80s. So it was like a multi-sports venue, and it only went to cricket specifically and solely in the 1890s, so shortly before this. So it was a huge area. So English grounds would have local rules about what constituted a boundary, 4 or 6. So 6 you had to hit out of the ground. In Australia, however, they gave you 5. If you hit it into the crowd, you got 5. But you had to change ends. So the batsman who'd hit the 5 would have to go up to the other end and his partner would come down, which seems, it's all wrong, isn't it? But
so it made comparisons between Australia and England at the time quite difficult because it was different number of runs depending on where in the world you were and actually what you'd actually hit. And this proves quite influential in the Jessop innings, which we're going to talk about. But there were some other differences in the game. The balls, the stumps, the pitches. Tell us a little bit about.
So everything was smaller, really. The ball was slightly smaller, not significantly, but slightly. The stumps were smaller. They were not as high and they were narrower. But the difference was that the pitches were uncovered. So if it rained, which often it would in England, and then the sun comes out and it starts to dry, you're basically getting tacky mud almost, or soil, so it's sticky, and then if you bowl into that, the ball will deviate. So the bowlers had a big advantage with the uncovered pitches. So the stumps and everything else, and the LBW was narrower. The LBW law, you had to have it pitching in line. It couldn't pitch outside leg or in line. So there was a much stricter definition for LBW. But the big thing for the bowlers was if it rained, you'd pick a wet weather specialist who knew how to spin the ball or cut the ball on a drying surface, and it would be very high. You get teams being bowled out for 15 and things like this because it was just impossible to bat. And in fact, it did rain on the second day of this match. It rained and it changed the course of the match. So things were cricket was very different. Do you want to talk about should we talk about the bats as well?
I just wanted to mention that if I've heard uncovered pitches once at Yorkshire, I've heard it 100 times, usually from Brian Close or Geoffrey Boycott telling me what it was like back in the day when they used to...
Because the uncovered pitches only properly stopped, I think, in the 70s, didn't they?
Yeah.
I think England Test matches up to 79 or something, they started to cover the run-ups and then leave the pitch uncovered during the hours of play, and then when they called it off, they'd cover it. It got very complicated, but they didn't properly stop till about 1980.
So we've talked a little bit about what it was like in the country. We've heard a little bit about Jessop and what cricket was like as a game and how it was evolving. Let's kind of zoom in a little bit and talk about this series in 1902. Australia playing in England. There was 4 tests before we come to the Oval for the 5th test, Jessop's test. Tell us a little bit about what went on in those first 4 games.
Well, it was one of the most dramatic test series there'd been. And when we talk about 2005 and 1981, 1902 could be bracketed with those, because in the first test, England bowled Australia out for 36. That is still Australia's lowest score. They were caught on a rain-affected pitch, we were talking about. But unfortunately, the rain returned and it stopped England winning the game. They were massively on top, and maybe with a couple more hours of play, they'd have won. But it was a draw. The second test was Lords was basically spoilt by rain. Then the third test was played at Sheffield.
At Bramall Lane.
Bramall Lane. Australia won that one quite comfortably. There's a lot of complaints about the smog and the light at Sheffield because of the chimney stacks.
Which is pretty normal, I think. But I think, just to interject, Simon, I think it's fair to say that this was Bramall Lane's one and only test match. So that's your first Yorkshire connection for this evening's discussion. Yeah. Bramall Lane hosted the 3rd test, and that was it. After that, everything...
Well, they played at Leeds in the previous Ashes series in England, and then they said, oh, we'll give Sheffield a try, and then they said, no, we're going back to Leeds now. So that was the end of Sheffield. And then the 4th test, very famous game, Australia won by 3 runs, one of the close, until I think Edgbaston 05, that was 2 runs, wasn't it? I think that was the narrowest there's been in England. And that was a thrilling game. That was where Fred Tate came out at number 11 with 4 runs needed, or 7 runs needed perhaps, and he got 4 and then he was out. And he was heartbroken, but he said, I've got a son who will restore my name, and that was Maurice Tate, obviously a famous bowler in the 20s. So that was a famous defeat, and it was pretty crushing for England because they only needed about 120 to win, and they were all out for 120, 181. So England had lost. So Australia won the series. They were 2 up with 1 to go. But England had now lost 4 Ashes series in a row to Australia, and there was a big crisis of confidence in English cricket that they'd always thought themselves superior to Australia. But it was finally dawning that perhaps the Australians were better at cricket than us.
So England hadn't won for nine Test matches.
At home.
Yeah. And Australia were clearly in the ascendancy. And coming into this 5th test, they were 2-0 up in the series, 2 draws, and they came into the Oval. We've talked about what it was like at the Oval, and the Oval was developing. We got Jessop back in the team. What about the rest of the makeup of the team coming into that final test, Simon? Yeah. Were there any other notable changes that had been made to that team?
England had controversially dropped Jessop after Sheffield, even though he'd scored 50-odd very quickly as a sort of makeshift opener. They dropped him for some reason. They also dropped George Hurst, who was a famous Yorkshire all-rounder, great player, very good fielder. Those 2 were we haven't really said that Jessop was the best fielder in England, best fielder there'd been, really. He was incredible. And when those 2 were left out, suddenly the fielding looked very creaky. And those 3 run, the 3-run defeat they'd have probably made the difference in that result had those 2 played. So Hurst and Jessop came back for the Oval. They were the main changes.
And also in the team was, of course, Wilfred Rhodes, another Yorkshire connection, and F.S. Jackson as well, who we'll talk about in a few moments. But the final test was very much a kind of roller coaster. It was a 3-day test, and tell us a little bit about day one and kind of how day one started to unfold.
So
the impact of the pitch and the weather at the end of day one as well.
So Australia batted first, and it was not a very sort of entertaining day. If you like, Australia ground out a score of 324, I think, which was a big score in those days. So they were well on top, and quite a few of the we didn't mention earlier, but England Test matches in England were only 3 days. They lasted 3 days. Whilst in Australia, they'd play them to a finish, partly because the weather tended to be better there, and you didn't get the uncovered pitches thing quite so much, I don't think. So when Australia got 3-2-4 on day one, everyone thought, well, England can't possibly win this match. The best they can hope for is a draw if they can get a similar score. But then it rains overnight on the first night, and so when England come back the next day, they've got to bat on an uncovered, a rain-affected pitch. It's been left open to the elements. England struggle. They almost don't avoid the follow-on, but they just do because Clem Hill drops a catch or something. So they get 180 odd. They're about 140 behind. Had they been 150 behind, they would have had to have followed. They could have followed, and they would have almost certainly lost then. As it was, they just save the follow-on. They make Australia bat again. Jessop runs out Victor Trumper, their best player, early on. Australia collapse. They stagger to stumps on about 120 for 8, I think. England get the last 2 wickets the next morning. And England are left chasing 263, which is still a big score for those days, but it's not impossible.
But it had never been chased down in England before, so it was the highest.
That would have been a record. It was a record.
To chase down in England.
Highest 4th innings chase in England. Yeah.
So that was facing them as they went into the third day. And tell us a little bit about the early session on the third day. Obviously, Jessop doesn't come in until just before lunch, but what was the beginning of that third day looking like, Simon?
Well, I think in hindsight, the second day, England had actually clawed their way back into the contest by getting Australia 120 for 8 by stumps, and then they got the last two wickets quickly. So they'd actually, although they were facing a mountain to climb, if you like, there was a possibility. They could see that there was a possibility. But before lunch, they collapsed against Jack Saunders, who was a left armer. Hugh Trumbull was Australia's greatest bowler. He took 140 wickets in Ashes tests, and until Dennis Lillee overtook him in the 80s, he was the top Ashes wicket taker, I think. He was a great bowler. Saunders was a tricky left armer. There's few suspicions about his action, things like that. But he triggered a collapse. England lost their top 5 for 48 when Jessop walked out to join F.S. Jackson, who was playing really well. The other guys really struggled. F.S. Jackson was playing beautifully.
Yeah.
Jessop comes and joins him 20 minutes before lunch. But the situation looked hopeless. Jessop played as he always plays, even though you might think, well, should he just play carefully to lunch? Not a bit of it. It's a bit like England now, really. They carry on regardless. He nearly inside edged into his stumps first ball.
But before we move on to that kind of period just before lunch, it's worth just reflecting on where England were, just to remind ourselves. So they were 48 for 5, chasing 263, going into the final day. And there are actually quite a lot of similarities to 2019 at Headingley, as I recall, in terms of the numbers. I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think there was something like they needed 212 or 215 or something, with 5 wickets in hand, and Jessop had 7 wickets in hand.
Stokes had 7 wickets.
Stokes had 7 wickets. Yeah. Jessop's had 5 wickets in hand. Yeah. So some very clear similarities in terms of that as a...
Yeah, so these two games, Headingley in 2019, the Oval 1902, England beat Australia by 1 wicket in both games. Only time it's happened in England. And Jessop and Ben Stokes were obviously the match winners. And when they arrived at the crease, the runs target was very similar.
Very similar.
Stokes had 7 wickets still to to play with. England still had 7 wickets to play with him. Jessop only 5, but it's quite a similar situation. Obviously, Stokes batted very differently to Jessop. He was very slow on the Saturday, if you remember. He batted through to stumps on about 4 off 50 balls or something like that. He just blocked it, and then only went into overdrive later, towards the end when Jack Leach came in. He batted, longer than Jessop ever batted in any innings in his life. Stokes at Headingley, even though we remember it as an explosive innings. So yeah, there's some nice parallels between those two innings, and they are. You could argue they are the 2 greatest innings, Test innings played.
And if you're doing Yorkshire Bingo, you can tick that off because that's a Headingley connection for 2019. So just coming back to Jessop, 48 for 5, walking to the crease, chasing 263. And we said earlier that Jessop had this reputation as a gung-ho batsman. Tell us a little bit about that immediate period just up to lunch, because he was his normal self in that period.
He was gung-ho, yeah. He was, he could have been bowled first ball, just inside edge past the stumps. In the 20s, he hit a low sort of hit down the ground. Victor Trumper ran in, couldn't quite get to it. It was a sort of skidding, flat shot, half chance possibly. And then a few minutes later, when he was on 27 or something like that, there was a missed stumping, but again, it was regarded as quite a sharp chance. So by the time he went in at lunch on 29 off only about 20 balls, he'd already had 3 escapes, and he was batting in a very frantic way. Yeah. But he'd actually shifted the momentum back a little bit towards England, and the Australians were maybe thinking, well, we're going to have to be careful with this guy because if he carries on like this.
He got his eye in, he seemingly got his eye in just in the period up to lunch.
And Jackson stayed with him to lunch. So at lunch, I think it was 87 for 5.
That Jackson-Jessop partnership was quite interesting. It's worth mentioning because Jackson and Jessop didn't really see eye to eye. Jackson had left him out as he'd been part of the selection panel, as you said earlier. But what was that dynamic like, do you think, between Jackson and Jessop in that partnership?
Well, yeah, what was interesting was that whatever Jackson thought about Jessop, I think he realised that if England were to win this game, Jessop was going to have to, have to get some runs, but equally Jackson had to stay there and support him. There's no point Jackson getting out. So he definitely, after lunch, he just almost stopped scoring completely. They added 100 together, and I think Jackson's share was something like 18, it was negligible.
So Jessop was accelerating, and Jackson was staying with him.
Yeah, and looking worse and worse, actually, apparently, by all the accounts. He was not convincing, but he hung in there.
Yeah, and what seemed noticeable from your book, Simon, is that Jessop's approach to the game seemed to change after lunch, whereas before lunch he was hitting pretty much everything and came close to being out. After lunch, he was picking certain shots and deciding what he was going to take and hit and what he was not.
Well, England had played Australia in that summer, 1982. They'd also just been to Australia for a tour the previous winter, so England had played 10 Test matches in the space of 10 months against Australia. Jessop had played in all but the one before when he was dropped. He'd faced Trumbull a lot, and he'd had a lot of problems with him. And I think he'd finally sort of worked out that if he was going to survive, he needed to cut out the crossbat shots that he liked and play straight. And Trumbull, for the entirety of the Jessop innings, he was bowling from the pavilion end, Jessop facing him, and he hit him. He only hit him in the sort of like
hit him on the left side.
Didn't. So having sort of gone through the accounts, this is what he said was true. He never hit a boundary off Trumbull's square of the wicket. It was all down the ground, and in fact, he hit him into the pavilion for what would have been 6s 3 times. Yeah. So he just played straight, and so it was a sort of strategically a very clever piece of work by Jessop.
Which was different for Jessop.
He neutralised Australia's biggest threat, Trumbull.
Yeah, and he also seemed to pick his bowlers to attack, because didn't he go hard on Saunders in 1 over?
Yeah, he hit him for, I think, 4 fours in a row in 1 over. I think he took 18 off an over from him, which was big news in those days, not so much now. But so, he really got stuck into Saunders and was far more careful with Trumbull.
And then Jackson was out, and Hurst came in.
Hurst came in.
After that. Tell us a little bit about that partnership.
Well, Hurst played a great innings. He was he would be there to the end. So I think when Jackson was out, they still needed about 100, maybe 90 of. So a lot of work was to be done. But Hurst stayed with Jessop. When Jessop then got out, he carried on through to the end. Hurst, but he was quite attacking as well, George Hurst. So he played a great innings really. But we haven't mentioned Jessop's bat though, which was. I mean, nowadays, anyone who's watched the IPL will know, you can mishit a six quite easily off with a modern bat. But Jessop's bat that he used in that innings still exists. It's in the museum at Lord's if ever you want to have a look at it. And it is such a fragile thing. It's so thin, particularly front to back. It's maybe 2 centimetres, maybe half the depth of a modern bat. Virender Sehwag used to have huge bats. David Warner had them so big that they changed the rules to bring them down. They were so thick. His is just like a wafer, really. But he also had he had his bats specially made. He had longer handles than normal. They were about. So I got Danny Rubin, the England media officer, to get one of Harry Brooks' bats when we were in Pakistan and measure Harry Brooks' bats for me, and I'd measured Jessop's bat. And apart from Harry Brooks' bat being much thicker, the main part of the blade was the same as Jessop's, but Jessop's had a longer handle. And Jessop used the longer handle to move his hands up and down according to what shot he was going to play. If he was going to play a cut, he'd move both his hands down to sort of like lever it. But if he was going to hit straight, high, he'd put his hands up to the top and obviously you get a longer swing when you longer lever. So he had specially made bats. I picked up this bat. Also the handle itself is really thick, even though nowadays a lot of batsmen have double grips, don't they, on their bats?
Yes.
He didn't have that, but the actual piece of wood is really thick. It still has the leather handle on that bat, but it's so different to a modern bat really in every way. But he made it work.
And so we saw Jessop edging towards his century, and then he got to 104.
So Australia, Joe Darling, the Australia captain, his one sort of ploy to try and stop Jessop, because he realised that if he didn't stop him, they were done for. He was to bring on Warwick Armstrong, who was the youngest man in the Australian team, subsequently captained Australia in the 20s. He was a leg spinner. He got him to bowl round the wicket into Jessop's legs to just try and sort of tie him up and stop him, just frustrate him, I suppose. And he did. He had a couple of quiet overs, and then Jessop sort of got the measure of him a bit more. But ultimately, Jessop got out to Armstrong, trying to sort of work him around the corner, and he was caught at short leg. So that ploy worked in the end.
And after that, we saw Hurst and Rhodes batting together. And it would be remiss of me not to mention for this audience Hurst and Rhodes together, because there's that famous line that they needed, was it around 15?
15,
towards the end of the test match. And what did they say? We'll get them in singles, which was where the famous line came from.
What was nice actually was one of the newspaper reports did say that when Wilfred Rhodes came out to join Hurst, that Hurst went and met him, and they did have a conversation. So they could have said that, because they definitely had a chat, but they both say, or at least one of them said, I think Wilfred said, we didn't say that at all.
Did Wilfred Rhodes hit a boundary as well?
And then it didn't happen anyway. There was a 2 where I think it was a drop catch, that somebody dropped a catch and it went for a sort of second. Oh no, it was an overthrow, that's right. It was a single that was turned into 2 by an overthrow, and then Rhodes edged it through the slips for 4 anyway, so it wasn't done in singles.
No, but England beat Australia, and the crowd, it's fair to say, went wild. I think you talk about the men throwing their hats up in the air.
I mean, it's like
it's a proper celebration.
There's lots of films or whatever you've seen where the men throw their boaters in the air, and ladies throw their hats on. But it seems like that did actually genuinely happen. People did sort of go berserk and throw their hats in the air, and umbrellas flying and all this sort of stuff.
A momentous occasion, a fantastic result, and it turned the tide for England.
And a pitch invasion, which I think was unusual in those days. Obviously, it became sort of standard fare, didn't it? But the crowd did just swarm onto the pitch. I mean, there had been
feel-good factor.
Yeah, we hadn't mentioned the fact that there was the coronation too. So the match started on a Monday. The Saturday, 2 days before, had been the coronation of Edward the Seventh. After Queen Victoria dying the previous year, but then his coronation had been delayed. He was ill, so it only happened in August 1902, even though she died in 1901. And so London had a big sort of party over the weekend, and there were a lot of Australian troops who'd come back from the Boer War, which had only just finished, in London. They came to the match, so there was a sort of quite a vibrant atmosphere at the game. In a way, I would say it was unusual for that period. It wasn't. It wasn't nowadays. Obviously, you get a sort of multinational crowd, don't you, in London? Say, I don't. In those days, I think that was quite unusual to have opposition fans.
It was almost that outcry of happiness, if you like, after everything that had gone on and the fact that Australia had been on top for so long. I want the audience to have a chance to ask a few questions, but I'd like to just bring this session to a close by talking about the pivotal question, which is the number of balls faced. Because you talk about the record, and all of the articles and all of the coverage after said that the innings, the century, had been achieved in 76 balls.
Well, some of them.
Some said it was.
Some said 75. There was a bit of confusion.
But you've forensically dissected what evidence you can find, because of course the scoring books are no longer available. Tell us a little bit about what you discovered, Simon.
Well, so the scorebooks are missing. There's always two scorers. There's an England scorer and an Australian scorer. Both the Surrey, the scorebooks, the England scorebooks for that would have been done by the Surrey scorer. They were lost in the Second World War, when obviously the ground became used by the army, and I think everything got moved out and they got lost. The Australian one went back with the Australians, who went on to South Africa on the way home. Book never saw the light of day after that. But I went through all the newspapers, and the reason I wrote the book was because I found the 76 ball claim that's been accepted was in the Athletic News that came out 5 days after the match. Nobody even knew about where it was published. When I started looking, I couldn't even find the source for the 76 balls until I got in touch with Jessop's family. He's got a daughter-in-law and her daughter. They're both still alive, and I spoke to them about it, and they helped me find the cutting for the 76 ball claim. It was in the Athletic News, which was a sports weekly. Then I went through all the other papers, and I found a report in the Morning Leader, which is a paper that everyone's forgotten about now, but was actually quite a good sports. It had a good sports section. And the morning after the game, it had a breakdown of every ball that Jessop faced. It was amazing. It was like a eureka moment. It was just like, and this is how his innings went, and it had every ball that he faced, who bowled it. Not only if it was a dot ball, not only was it a dot ball, but it said whether he played a shot at it or whether he left it. So just shoulder.
It's like gold dust for you.
Yeah. So this is like the sort of stuff that modern scorers do, but people in those days never did. No. And I quickly looked down it and realised that there was 71 balls in this list, rather than 76. So that's when I decided I had to do the book to try and work out the answer. So then I had to reconstruct the whole innings over by over, and using all the newspaper reports to piece together what happened. And I came to the conclusion that both accounts had made a mistake, and that actually the answer is something between 71 and 76. It's 72 to 74 is the verdict. You have to make, obviously, every over tally, and you've got to get the strike with the right person, and it's quite complicated, to say the least. But I managed to make it work and also fit all the accounts. So I think I got to the answer, but there's a couple of points win and over where you're never quite sure when the strike changed hands, whether the single was off the third ball or the fourth ball or whatever. So there's a couple of little things I couldn't quite pin down, but
the conclusion is
it's fewer than 76.
That the long-standing belief that this record, which still stands by an English batsman, was delivered in 76 balls. Simon's proved that it was somewhere between 72 and 74. The question I've got is, what happens if Johnny Bairstow manages to get a 73? What do we say? Does he have the official record or not?
Well, the funny thing was when the book came out in last summer when India were touring, And Jamie Smith, as you may remember, got an 80-ball 100 at Edgbaston. And he was on course for the record. I'd just done a piece in the Sunday Times about the book, although it wasn't out, but explaining the story. And I couldn't believe it. It was like, this guy's going to break Jessop's record, like 4 days after I published this article. And Smith got to 84 off 61, at which point my sports editor rang and said he's going to do it, isn't he? I said, I know, it's just I can't believe this is happening. You know. And he said, I'm going to put the phone down and leave you to your moment of private grief. Anyway, miraculously, Jadeja came on and he bowled a really quiet over to Smith. He went for one or something. And
the record stands.
The record survived. But Michael Atherton was on Sky TV talking with Mark Butcher, and he said, Simon Warren's just written this article in the paper saying that Jessop's record isn't 76, it's less than that. And Mark Butcher said, well, what is it? And he said, well, Simon says it's 72 to 74. And Mark Butcher went, well, thanks very much. That's not very helpful, is it? We still don't know what the answer is.
But what we do know is that the record has been delivered in faster than 76 balls, and it makes it really interesting to see who breaks it and what that score will be at some point down the line. I'm going to stop our conversation at that point because I think it's great to give the audience a chance to ask any questions. It's a fascinating story. And please, if there's anybody out there that would like to ask Simon a question, we have a microphone if you'd like to put your hand up. There's a question at the back in the middle, please. If you could just tell us your name and tell us your question. Thank you.
My name is Mike Waters, and my question is, how would the number of balls be affected if the modern rule for scoring a 6 had counted? Did Jessop hit balls into the crowd but not out of the ground?
Yes, good point. Well, he hit 3 over the boundary hits, which would count as 6 in today's terms, all off Trumbull into the pavilion straight. But it would only have actually brought the ball's face to get to his 100 down by 1, because one of those 6s would have happened after he got to his 100 in a recalculation. And he'd hit the ball before he got to 100 for 4 anyway, so those 2 6s sort of like only saved 1 ball, a bit complicated. But the answer is that it would be 1 ball fewer. In fact, so when I was speaking to Jessop's family about this record, they're very sort of proud of it, obviously. Yeah. And they said, whoever breaks his record, they've got to remember that they're hitting 6s and Gilbert couldn't hit any 6s.
Proper 6s.
In the family, it's an important point that you've just raised there, that the 6s are, he couldn't hit a 6, so.
Very good. Thanks for the question. Anyone else like to raise something? Another question next to this gentleman.
Jeff Wildsfeed. This was primarily about this big innings, but do you accept that Jessop was a talented all-rounder?
A talented all-rounder?
Yeah.
Yeah. He was, but his career sort of like divided into 2, really. His bowling, he was a very fast, aggressive, sort of short pitch bowler in his early days, perhaps not as sort of short pitched as he was only 5'7", so he wasn't going to be bowling many very high balls, but he was a very good bowler for the first 6 years of his first class career, and he took about 600 wickets. But he had back issues and he declined as a bowler, and about the time of this series he was not bowling very much. In fact, when England picked him for the 5th test, Lord Hawke, who was the chairman of the panel, said, I need to know if you're going to be able to bowl in this match. And Jessop said he could, and he did bowl in his last game for Gloucestershire before the test, but in fact he only bowled a few overs in the test and he didn't take a wicket. So he'd sort of gone into decline as a bowler by then for back issues rather than any lack of ability, but his career stats are pretty impressive as a bowler and a batsman as well as a fielder. So.
There was one notable point in this match of fielding. Didn't he do a throw-in to get Trumper?
Yeah.
Which kind of turned the game potentially.
Yeah.
His fielding had a big impact as well. Thanks for the question. Anyone else like to ask a question? Just down at the front, please, and then I'll come to the back after that. Just here. One moment. We'll just get the microphone for the camera.
Why do you think it took probably about another 80 years before an England player got anywhere close to it, like Ian Botham, for example?
Yeah, well, good question. Yeah. Well, I think Test cricket sort of slowed down a bit. I mean, the golden age, pre-First World War, was an exciting period, and there were a few players, not quite like Jessop, but Victor Trumper was very attacking. For example, the English cricket did have attacking players as well. That era produced quite a few attacking players. But by the 20s, the professionals were sort of taking over the Test team, and they were far more cautious by nature. Even Jack Hobbs and Sutcliffe were more interested in sort of building a big score than getting there particularly fast. Test cricket in the 50s was very slow. 60s the same. Things only really sort of picked up once one-day cricket came in and batsmen developed a bigger repertoire of shots, and a few little funky scoops and all this sort of stuff came in as one-day cricket developed. So it's only really in the modern era, from the 80s onwards, I mean, you mentioned both of them, that the record came back into view, if you like. But yeah, both of them scored, in 81 he scored 100 off 86 balls and 87 balls in that series. So he got quite close to Jessop. But I think it's to do with the way Test cricket was played, and then it started to speed up in the modern era when one-day cricket came in, and obviously now there's very little difference sometimes between a Test match and a T20, where they seem to be playing the same sort of game sometimes, don't they? And yeah, they can get close to Jessop's record. In fact, I didn't really explain, but the sort of interest in balls faced only really came in once one-day cricket became common in the 70s and 80s onwards, and then scorers and TV coverage started to focus on the balls faced rather than the minutes batted, which used to be the thing that they would measure an innings by. And Botham's innings against Australia were one of the things that Wisden started publishing fastest hundreds by balls faced around the time that Botham was was breaking lots of records of his own, really, in terms of fast scoring, and Viv Richards the same. And the emphasis shifted towards balls faced.
Thank you. We had a question right in the middle at the back, please.
Thank you. My name's Stephen Thornton. You've mentioned about the batting, but not a lot about the Australian bowling. And the circumstances of this test is that it's the final test. It's effectively a dead rubber. And it's not uncommon for perhaps the bowling order to be mixed around from a touring side that's a bit tired of touring and ready to go home, and perhaps isn't taking it as seriously as perhaps they should have if there was something riding on it. So in terms of your research, was there some curious bowling changes in this test match, or was it the Australian frontline bowlers?
Well, far from there being curious bowling changes, Joe Darling, the captain, was criticised for not changing his bowling enough. He just kept Saunders on at one end and Trumbull on at the other for a large chunk of the innings, and he only belatedly sort of thought, maybe I'd better change things, and brought on Armstrong, and then also Monty Noble, who was quite a good sort of containing bowler. So it reminded me a bit of both of them at Headingley in 81, when Kim Hughes just kept ploughing away with Terry Alderman and Dennis Lilly, if you remember, and he didn't bowl Ray Bright. I think he had a spinner in the team, and he just kept plugging away. And then Jeff Lawson, he had three seamers, and he'd forgot Ray Bright, and Kim Hughes got criticised the same for just like staying on track as the carnage ensued. And I think that's probably the criticism of the Australians in this game, that actually they didn't change the bowling enough, and Darling got a bit sort of stuck with what was happening and didn't respond fast enough.
Thank you. Any final? We've got about three or 4 minutes. One more just up here.
Vic Clays. Do you mind me just asking a more general question away from the mental?
Yeah.
I'd welcome your thoughts on Stokes' recent misdemeanours and what's going to happen there.
Well, I'm just going to check he's not resigned yet, but I think no.
He hadn't, as of about an hour ago.
No. Yeah, there's been a lot of. I was at the game at Lord's, and I was talking to Michael Atherton today about it, and we were saying that Stokes had not seemed himself before the match, particularly in the press conference he did with us the day before the game. He's normally full of energy and sort of like enthusiasm for the series ahead, the summer ahead, and he was a bit sort of flat, really. And it was a surprise what happened on Sunday. The there's two things really. You could say that the management are going to be really annoyed with what's happened because Richard Thompson, Richard Gould, Rob Key, Brendan McCullum, the guys above Stokes all thought they were having a reset and they were going to have a serious team that were going to be more professional after what happened in Australia. And then in the first test they have since Australia, the captain, no less, goes out drinking and breaks the curfew, essentially, which is a sort of fairly obvious breach of his own rules. It's extraordinary that he did that. But I would say that that's possibly more, it's a reflection that Stokes is not. So Stokes, after the Ashes, he did an interesting interview with ECB's own sort of internal website, which got largely forgotten. But I watched it recently and I wrote a piece about it. But he said that he'd had a long, hard think after Australia as to whether he wanted to carry on. And he said, I went to some dark places. Like I said, I've done this before, and I sort of did it again. But I decided in the end that I did want to carry on. So I think he's genuinely been unsure whether to carry on, and I think maybe what's just happened is a symptom that his head isn't, and the way he's behaved in the last week, his head isn't in the job anymore. And also because Bazball failed in Australia, that was his project, that was his idea, his philosophy, and that's sort of like dead now, really. So what does a Ben Stokes England team look like? And I don't think he knows. And we don't know, and they just keep coming. McCullum says, "Oh well, we'll be a bit more restrained," but essentially he wants to do the same thing. But Stokes doesn't believe it anymore because he said teams have worked us out. So I genuinely think that Stokes, as a captain, he's run out of ideas, and so this might just be a manifestation of the fact that he's lost his way. And there's been rumours today that he might just either A, resign the captaincy, or B, just give up cricket altogether. So we're sort of waiting to hear what he's going to say. So I think what the breaking the curfew, drinking late looks bad, and I think that's a consequence of something else rather than being the most worrying development. I think it's a consequence of him not being happy in his job. So I don't know what's going to happen, but.
One thing's for sure, the management will have some head scratching to do because they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. If they hammer him, they'll be criticised for impacting potentially on the team spirit and the rest of the squad. If they don't hammer him, they'll be criticised for not putting some discipline in place and putting in place a plan after what happened previously in the Ashes. So there'll be a lot of head scratching tonight, and I don't envy Richard and his colleagues in dealing with it. On that note, I'm going to try and bring tonight's event to a close. First of all, I'd like to thank our special guest, Simon Wilde, for a fantastic discussion and presentation. Please put your hands together and say thank you to Simon.